When we were young, we read more often because we had to. It was the only way for us to get knowledge and to be enlightened. Read to your heart's delight and be enlightened. Let's just read. It's a podcast by Andy's Personal Development. Stay tuned for more reading and enlightenment. Hi, this is Andy of Andy's Personal Development, and we are currently live on this episode of Let's Just Read. We have a special guest that we want to share with you today. His name is Dan Handel, and the theme of this episode is the role of nature in shaping modern cities, something that he's quite versed in and is one of his core competencies in terms of the many skills and the values that he holds and he's going to bring to this episode of Let's Just Read. He is an architect, a curator. He's the founding editor of Manifest, a journal of the Americas, and he's also a writer. This guy was the inaugural young curator at the Canadian Center for Architecture in Montreal, and he has developed exhibitions for the Venice Biennale and Het Nieuwe Institute in Rotterdam. So he is very versed, and today he wants to speak about many things, including the topic, but he also wants to focus on Design Forest, a Cultural History, a new book that he's written and is about to release soon out in the public. So without further ado, I just want to ask that you welcome our guest, Dan Handel, as we bring him on live in the program. Dan, welcome, and we are glad to have you on Let's Just Read. How are you doing today?
I'm good, Andy. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful, wonderful. So, out of the many skills that you have and the portfolios that you carry, what do you think defines you the most in terms of your legacy that you're currently building? When people hear the name Dan Handel, what do you want to come to their mind as something that you know you have made an impact upon their lives with?
I am trying not to think too much about legacy yet. But I would say that what you call the sort of diverse skills, or sort of mini histories of my, if you could call it a career, were actually fragments of the same trajectory, right? So the road we're talking today about nature and forests, which is a project that really defined my road in the past 15 or so years. So it turned out to be a couple of exhibitions. So I was curator of these exhibitions, and then it turned out to be presentations or conversations like the one we're having right now, or the book that is going to be published. But it's part of the same kind of journey, which is both an internal journey, to discover things about yourself. But then at the same time, it becomes a journey that allows you to meet people and have conversations. And these conversations are really what informed not only my knowledge, but the sort of my understanding, and hopefully what the message could be out of this project.
Yeah. Thank you, Dan. We appreciate that. Thank you for sharing. So, in terms of the theme, which is the role of nature in shaping modern cities, how would you describe that? How does nature play that specific role in shaping modern cities?
I think the first thing to sort of throw in the air here is what exactly do we speak about when we talk about nature?
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that nature and forests specifically, which is the sort of, the part of nature which you could say my project is sort of focused on, are not things that exist out there in the world
Mm-hmm.
by
Mm-hmm.
themselves.
Yeah.
They are defined, they were defined historically, and they're still being defined by our concepts, by our cultural concepts. So if you grew up in one part of the world, in the Caribbean, for instance, and I grew up in the Middle East or in, I don't know, in Northern Europe, we would have different concepts about what is a forest. Because again, it's not a thing in the world. Nothing
Mm-hmm.
defines a forest. It's something
Right.
that you are brought up to understand as a forest, and it could be very different between these different cultural and geographical contexts. And once
Mm-hmm.
you have this idea of a forest in your mind, it shapes the way you think about natural environments, and it shapes the way we think about cities. So that's the next thing. Once we, I think, once we realize that most of the forests we know are artificial, they're not natural in a, in a popular sense, right? That they did not exist always in the same way we know them now, and this includes, the Amazon and the Black Forest in Germany and all these famous forests that we are used to think of as natural, but they're not. Once we realize that, we can begin to understand the role that humans have in shaping what we call natural environments.
Okay.
And what I try to, what my sort of search into these subjects led me to begin and understand is that in the same way that our concepts about nature shape nature, they also come back to shape our own living environment. So our cities, or whatever suburbs or wherever we live, because we have these ideas, these culture specific ideas by which we operate. And then when somebody is discussing, let's say, the development of a new part of a city, it is shaped by these ideas, right? So again, it's not just about an objective idea of nature. It's really specific to a culture and a time in which it is being debated.
Yeah. Wow, that's quite interesting, Dan. Thank you for sharing. Now, I'm looking at your information and it says over the past 15 years, you have been studying the links between scientists, forest managers, and spatial designers, resulting in various exhibitions and publications on the subject. What are some of the challenges that you have met with regards to maybe not culture, but in terms of the concept of these people and how they see the world, how they see forests, how they see spatial designs, and how they can bring them all together to produce one final product, something which you are quite versed in as based from what I've heard so far.
I think it's a very good question. I'm coming from architecture, so this is my background, so design basically, and
Yeah.
this is how I started looking at buildings. But um, once you begin to go out of your discipline and also out of your comfort zone, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
when I began to visit forests and talk with people who manage these forests, and then people who are in charge of the policy that shapes these forests, um, etc., it became clear that on the first phase, it looked as if we're not even speaking the same language, right? So
Mm.
there was
Yeah.
almost like a terminology barrier at first.
Mm-hmm.
um, and it took a while, to develop these conversations. But then I also realized after a while that while the words may be different, and that and the disciplinary sort of language may be somewhat different, um, actually scientists and designers and land managers share the same cultural ideas. And this became the subject of my work, actually, the ideas that we share,
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
the language that separates us.
Okay. Wonderful. And how did you develop the passion for doing this? When did it dawn on you that, hey, Dan, you could be good in this and you could excel and make a difference or make an impact in the world?
There's not. I think there's not an easy answer
Uh huh.
to this
Uh huh.
question. I think it's really about finding some sort of an inner voice, right? So you don't
Okay.
know that this would be your project for the next, I don't know, decade or more.
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
my case, at least, I didn't know that. So it was not a 5-year plan or 10-year plan. It was more about stumbling upon certain things that resonate with you. So you have these chance encounters with
Mhm.
environments that suddenly stimulate you on both the visceral, the most primal way on the one
Mhm.
hand, but
Mhm.
then also triggers all sorts of more intellectual kind of questions. And
Okay.
then I went into the history, and then I went into this entire trajectory of looking into the subject.
Okay, great. Wonderful. You are also the founding editor of Manifest, a journal of the Americas. Tell us a bit about that and the passion or the fulfillment that that brings to you.
Well, I spent some time living in the States, in the United States, a couple of
Mm-hmm.
years back, and when I was there, again in the context of design and urban planning, um, it was kind of curious that nobody in let's say almost nobody in the universities looked at American space. And when I'm saying American space, I don't only mean the United States, I mean the sort of north-south
Yeah. Yeah.
axis that connects all these
Mm-hmm.
places that happen to be
Yeah.
on the same continent.
Right.
So the idea behind Manifest, which I co-founded with two partners, very good scholars and interesting collaborators, was really to look at that as one geographical unit. And once you do that, again, you focus less on what separates, let's say, Canadian space from, I don't know, Mexican cities,
Mm.
and
Okay.
you begin to see connections. Of course, I would have to say this is not to say that this is a homogeneous kind of unit in any way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But once you frame it in such a way, I think you begin to see all the narratives that make this sort of this enmeshed kind of continent. And this was the point here.
Yeah. Good, good. I get that. I get that and I appreciate that. Now when you look at architecture and you look at nature and the shaping of nature and architecture and the designing of modern cities, something that comes to my mind is the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. And I'm
Mhm.
sure you're pretty familiar with it. I bring up that then to ask you, what would you measure the impact or the philosophy of what you do in that realm in terms of the influence? Is it going back to Roman time, Greek times,
Mhm.
Babylonian times? What would you say would be the one that most influenced you and has the greater impact on what you do in terms of the passion for this kind of thing?
I think it's interesting that you bring up the sort of hanging gardens. I mean, we don't know if the hanging gardens existed, right? There's no
Right,
archaeological evidence
right.
that they existed,
Mm-hmm.
which to me makes it even more interesting, right? Because
Right.
once we don't know if they were there, it really puts them in the sort of realm of metaphor, which is what I'm
Mm-hmm.
interested in. It's a
Right.
cultural idea. And I think the cultural idea of a hanging garden resonates in our contemporary cities. So if you look at
Uh-huh.
some of the more visible forest buildings that were built in the last, let's say, decade, there's a project called Bosco Verticale, the vertical forest in Milan, in Italy, two towers covered with, I don't know, 2,000 trees and shrubs,
Yeah.
which present this sort of idea of a forest that grows on the building. There's in New York all these initiatives to plant, 1 million trees, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's a very powerful metaphor, and to me, it's interesting because it didn't remain the same. So once you
Mm-hmm.
understand it or try to understand it in previous decades, you
Yeah.
see that it's more of a cyclic kind of idea, right? So it
Ah,
it
okay.
pops up, and it really makes sense with forests, right? Because they're cyclic in many ways. So this idea is really there in antiquity, and then it comes back again, I don't know, in Renaissance, and then you would see it again in the 21st century, right? So
Right.
these are the kind of dynamics that I find kind of fascinating with these cultural ideas.
Yeah.
Each era and time
Mm-hmm.
endows different meanings to the same kind of
Yeah.
cultural image.
Yeah. Dan, this is something that always interests me, and I guess many experts would have had different interpretations of how they saw this particular phenomenon. Basically, you have the Roman history with the Roman Empire, where they would have these colosseums, where they would have these games and so on, and they would have gladiators and warriors, and that would be a public spectacle. And then on the other hand, you have the Egyptian culture with the Sphinx and all that amazing architecture that we sometimes try to understand but can't. What is your take on that in terms of the fact that in these modern times we have so many tools and technology available to us, but it seems as though they were so far advanced back then that they would produce such monuments that are still standing today, Dan? What's the contrast?
I think, you know, part of it has to do with the feeling that you get once you witness or experience something that survived the test of time
Mm-hmm.
for this many years, right? So I think part of the impact of standing next to the pyramids in Egypt,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, even if they're not, you know, meticulously preserved, if even if they're
Mm-hmm.
slightly changed, you know, some of them were covered by sand for centuries,
Yeah.
you know, all these kind of
Yes.
things. Or the monuments of Persepolis in ancient Persia that were again
Mm-hmm.
covered in sand for many centuries. I
Yeah.
think just witnessing the sheer size and the sheer survival of these monuments is probably, I don't know, 80% of the sort of power they have in our mind. So
Ah.
I would say that our era, you know, some things may survive for the future and would have, I think, similar impact.
Mm. Yeah. Okay. Okay, I hear you, Dan. So I want to switch gears a bit and focus on the writing. You are author of Design Forest, a Cultural History. Tell us a bit about that. How did you come up with the name? What's the basic impact of that publication, the message that you want people to get out of it as far as the releasing of the publication is concerned?
So again, you know, I've been immersing myself in all these kind of forest, real and imagined forest for a while, and then the question became, as you say, what exactly is the sort of central message that you would like to communicate? And to me, again, we talked about the sort of cultural ideas and how it is our ideas that shape realities. So to me, this became an important thread. Um, and the other one, you know, beyond sort of discussing some of these ideas, which became the sort of structure of the book, right? So each part of the book basically deals with one cultural idea and how it connects against scientists and foresters and designers, etc., through specific projects and specific times. But then it also became important to stress that if we you know, if our ideas shape our realities, we also stand a chance of changing the course of development as it is happening today in cities, which we know now has, you know, some negative impacts on our environment and on societies. So I think if you look at the mainstream of how development is being done today in major cities, and not only in cities, also in suburbs, also in agricultural development, also in, I don't know, resort development, you know, you would see that the way it's being sort of run in the past 20, 30, 40 years is a very, very destructive way of thinking about resources, thinking about what would be left after this development is done. Um, etc. So the book is also trying to address these issues and say that what we suffer is not only a real environmental crisis, but also what Amitav Ghosh, the writer, calls the crisis of imagination, right? So we also have to go out of our minds and perhaps imagine different relationships between nature and cities, right? And once we imagine these relationships, I would say there's probably a way to make it real.
All right. I love that. Thank you for sharing that. So I just want to put up on the screen the cover of the book here, Design Forests. And I want you to tell us what brought on that design on the cover there. What inspired it? And how did you come up with it? Or was it just the editing people or the publishing people or a combination of you and they coming together? But where did the original idea of the cover come from?
No, actually, this painting that is shown on the cover
Yeah.
is probably one of the most important paintings in my mind in terms of how a
Ah,
forest is being described.
okay.
This is a 14th century painting by an early Renaissance artist called Paolo Uccello,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
who was a sort of master of perspective. And what is interesting about this painting, apart from the fact that it shows a forest, it deals with a specific activity that is, as you can see, a hunt. So there's a group of
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
hunting in the forest. The painting is called A Hunt in the Forest. And what is interesting about that, in my mind, and it also resonates to some of the things we already talked about, is that this entire forest is artificial. And you could see that because once you look at the painting, you see that the trees are have been cut in a specific way.
Yeah. Yeah.
That the hunt is happening at night, which would never be the case in real 14th
Mm-hmm.
century hunting. So this is a reconstructed scene of an entirely artificial environment, and this, in a way, leads to the first point that again we talked about, and that is that forests around the world are mostly artificial and are shaped by our cultural ideas. So in this specific case, the cultural or the idea that shapes the forest is the activity of the hunt. The hunt is a very specific ceremonial activity. Of course, it relates to a specific class of people. You and I would probably not have been admitted to this hunt, and this group of people really shape the environment, the so-called natural environment. So this is a good point to
Mm-hmm.
start the discussion that the book is trying to unpack.
Okay. I love it. Thank you for sharing, Dan. When is it to be released, actually?
It is going to be available for pre-order next week, so
Next week. Okay.
very soon.
Okay. Can you tell folks how they can get that pre order? Is there a special link that they can go to and assign themselves?
Right now, it exists on Amazon and
Mm-hmm.
on the Routledge website, which is the
Mm-hmm.
publisher. It
Yeah.
will be available on Barnes and Noble. It would also be available as an ebook in a couple of weeks for those who like to get it, faster in their hands. So yeah, I think there are many options to get it.
All right. Thank you for sharing. You know, you said something pretty interesting there, Dan, and I'm thinking about our current ecosystems. And there has been a concern quite a while now about the continued disappearance of natural forests.
Right.
And we're looking at the balance of heat being now to the point where it has become quite unbearable. We see devastating fires in several parts of the world, especially in the state of California. If you were to be the expert and you were to give advice to cities with regards to how they can preserve the balance that's necessary in the ecosystem with regards to natural forests, producing that air that we need to balance with what is happening in the city. What are some of the ways that you would tell them that these things should find that natural integration so that it becomes a healthier balance and takes away all the pain obviously that we are feeling now?
I think one thing to keep in mind is that, again, once you discuss something like an urban forest, which is a phrase that has been in the air in the past, I don't know, 40 years, perhaps
Yeah,
in the United States, and then in
yeah.
North America and Europe, and now in, let's say all major African cities, for instance, have plans for urban forest. So it's pretty widespread in terms of integrating it in urban development. But I think what experience shows us is that, again, this is not a neutral thing, right?
Okay,
So
okay.
you have to discuss, I think, with the communities involved, what are the values that you're trying to promote? Because,
Mm,
for instance, urban forests in themselves are not necessarily going to help you in the sort of global challenges of carbon
mm,
emissions and things like
yeah,
that. They
yeah.
might help you and they can help you in addressing challenges in municipal areas, right? So let's say they could become food forests for impoverished communities. They could become places for activities for certain communities. They could, in other places, they could raise real estate values if that's important for you. So I think what we need to, or the type of conversations that we need to have are conversations in which the people who actually live in these cities and are going to be living there and using these cities in the next, I don't know, couple of decades would have a voice, not in terms of the design or the type of trees, but what are the priorities in this specific urban or suburban kind of environment in which they're trying to, um, you know, um, develop, right? So what's the most important thing to think about for these communities? That's, I would say, that's the best way
Mm-hmm.
to go forward and not repeat some of the mistakes that have been done with open forestry in the past.
Wow. Okay, great. I appreciate that. Thank you for sharing. You were quite detailed and obviously clear in your thinking there. Have you been to India in the past 5 years or so, Dan?
I have not, but my current research, I hope, is going to take me there, because some of the interesting projects in terms of afforestation, large scale afforestation to combat desertification and pollution is happening now in India.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah,
hopefully
yeah,
that's in my near future, in the next 5 years and not
yeah.
in the previous 5 years. Yeah.
Okay, okay. And what about the hyper technological forests in California? What is your take on that?
I think that's again a cultural metaphor. I think
Mm-hmm.
we live in a society or societies that are becoming more and more technologically obsessed, right?
Yeah, yeah.
We were just discussing technology and whether it's a blessing, is a blessing or a curse, just a couple of minutes
Yeah,
ago.
yeah,
um, and I think, again, this is probably one of the more present cultural ideas in our time, and it affects the way we design forests. So in the specific case of these forests in California, what
mm-hmm.
I try to argue is that you go to these forests, which are managed by universities or research institutions, and you find environments that are very different from the forest you see behind me right now, for instance,
Yeah,
right? This sort of
yeah.
idea of
Mm-hmm.
a natural environment untouched by humans. You actually see, a space really populated by machines, by all sorts of sensors and transmitters and trees, of course, that sort of capture and transmit information all the time in order to better manage this specific force. So the cultural idea that it puts a high value on technology really restructures and reshapes natural environments in very dramatic ways, I would say.
Yeah, yeah, wonderful. In terms of the forests that now exist in the world today, and maybe okay, I can call three countries where I have seen, I have not been there physically, but through social media and research, I've seen New Zealand has some fantastic green outdoors and natural spring waters. developing. They have a similar scenario in Holland, where they have these windmills out there producing natural wind turbine and so on. And the other place I can't recall right now, but I think it's three countries that I would have seen that seem to be working towards developing that kind of greater eco balance. In terms of what we see happening, we also need to take into consideration, Dan, that forests will come down at some point in time, either by natural destruction forces, hurricanes, etc., or man in terms of exploitation and logging, the logging industry and stuff. In your travels, in your experience, in your experimentation, based on your expertise, which one of any, if any country at all, would you see that seems to have a greater understanding of the impact that their role plays in terms of the balance that is supposed to happen with regards to forestry, natural outdoors, and modern city life?
First, I would respond to your statement about the disappearing forest, and would say that
Uh
this
huh.
is also part of our conception, because once
Yeah.
you look at the previous decades, for instance,
Uh huh.
you would see that in some parts of the world forests are disappearing or declining, and in other
Yeah.
parts actually you have more forest cover. So it depends.
Yes. Yeah.
And this has
Okay.
been the case, I would say, in previous centuries even. So, for instance, if you went to Germany in the 19th century, which we are used to think of
Mm-hmm.
as a very forested country today,
Yeah. Yeah.
you would see almost no forest. And this was the same with France,
Yeah.
and various other countries there. So in various times, humans actually managed to bring back forest cover for all sorts of reasons and motivations. Um, but I think now, if I were to look for a positive example of at least a discussion that is happening in terms of the balance that you mentioned, I think Canada is a pretty good
Yeah.
example.
Yeah.
Not,
Yeah.
I would say, not all of Canada, right? There have been a lot of discussions with the logging companies and the destructive sort of practices in Western Canada, but still, this is quite a good example in terms of how you utilize forest resources while keeping the values, both both the material, but also the sort of spiritual, cultural values. There's a lot of discussion happening with indigenous communities in Canada and how they can be stewards of forest environments while not leading to the destruction of these environments, right? So they could stay there for the long term. Um, so this is one example, and I think a slightly different example would be Switzerland, which has a lot of forest resources and has been dealing a lot with how you, on the one hand, take down the material because they build a lot with wood, for instance. So how do you use the material, but at the same time, how do you develop strategies through which the forest could remain both as sort of cultural artifacts because they're important for their culture, and also as a sort of environmental assets. So that's another good example. And I would also say that probably Japan is an interesting example because
Yeah. Yeah.
while they were cutting down trees massively in the 20th century and even before that, um, I think they have a very, generally speaking, I would say they have a very interesting connection with forest environments, and they place high cultural and also spiritual value in some forests, and that's why forests are maintained in a different way than they are being maintained in other places. So it's an interesting case to look at for sure.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful. We have come to the end of this amazing interview with Dan Handel and his book that is soon to be released. He's the author of Design Forests, a cultural history. He's also a curator, he's involved in architecture, and we have been listening to his expertise and his core competencies with regards to the theme of the episode, which is entitled The Role of Nature in Shaping Modern Cities with Dan Handel. I've just put two sets of information up on the screen there, his Instagram uh, handle and as well as his website. And so, any parting words, Dan? Anything that you'd like to say to our audience? For those who were here, there was an audience a while ago, and for those who would be on later when we have this edited and streamed on the different platforms, any parting statements you'd like to leave with us?
Yeah, I would just say that, each of us, as we mentioned, have a sort of force in our, in us, in a way, in our mind. And I
Yeah.
think the conversation that I would hope to have with people who listen uh, to this cast right now, would be, what is the type of force that you have in your mind, and how this shapes your ideas about the world around us. And I think that could be a beginning of, further conversations that we could have.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you so much for being an amazing guest and for sharing your expertise and so much value. I'm sure that you have brought a greater understanding of the role that we can play in shaping the nature and the really the beauty of our world in which we have been so blessed to be in. So there you have it, folks. Dan Handel has been in the house. We are still live on Let's Just Read, and we're about to wrap up. So before we go, just to remind you that our watchwords are read for enlightenment, knowledge, and information. Read for enlightenment, knowledge, and information. Let's get back to reading again. Okay? So until next time, this is Andy of Andy's Personal Development Live on Let's Just Read together with my guest, Dan Handel, saying so long. God bless.
Thank you so
Keep
much.
doing what you can to make this world a better place for each and everyone to live in. Bye for now,
Amen.
guys. Take care.